So we can see then that there's an interrelationship between Gebser's model of each one of these consciousness structures having an early, moderate, qualitative phase of efficient use. In the magical, for example, this is the use of magic in an effectual way, but every one of these structures moves into its later phase into a deficient, immoderate, aggregative, and quantitative use of its energies, which becomes immoderate and overuses. In the deficient magical phase, we have an overuse and an over-reliance upon sorcery, black magic, and spellcasting. They get more and more immoderate, and more they're just used too much. You can clearly see this, of course, in the deficient phase of the mental consciousness structure, with an over-reliance on the mental consciousness structure in an aggregative sense to dice matter up and continually chop it into pieces and to use machines to manipulate it and push it about. And it continues to be extensive and aggregative and merely quantitative. And you can see the analogy with Spengler's idea that every civilization has a culture period of vital energies in which the civilization's energies are intensive and build up the culture in a vital, effectual way, versus the civilization phase when it begins to shift into a geographically extensive mode and begins to become merely quantitative and concerned with aggregating land in the building of empires and the gradual decline of the mental or of the effectual cultural energies. So that's the influence, I think, of Spengler on Gebser here, is this idea that each one of these consciousness structures eventually decays and collapses like one of Peter Sloterdijk's spheres, which collapse and then spill forth their contents across the landscape, which are no longer then immunologically protected by the spherological boundaries of a membrane that hold it together and protect it. We are still in an unprotected mode, even though as the result of the World War, the Allies have of course put in their utopian vision of a shopping mall consumer society. It nonetheless leaves the human being still ontologically, because it doesn't address meaning. It doesn't address what it means to be in such a world at such a place and time. So it still leaves the human being ontologically exposed to all sorts of psychological illnesses and problems, hence drug addiction, crime, gangs, spousal abuse, all the things that are going on now that result from the human being in an exposed, unprotected, unimmunized mode of existence. So he makes some other excellent points in this chapter, but I want to move to the end of the chapter where he talks about the evolution of religious phenomenology in each of these structures of consciousness. And he talks about how with the magical we have graven images, idols, and rituals, whereas in the mythical we have gods, symbols, and mysteries. Then in the mental we have God, one God, dogma, and method, presumably method of the Cartesian type. Now the thing I want to draw your attention to here is that he groups in the mental consciousness structure Spengler's Magian civilization. He puts it in with the mental consciousness structure that begins with the Greeks about 500 BC, puts them both together, and says that basically the emphasis on monotheism, on one God, is a foreshadowing and a forecasting of the mental structure's emphasis, the later phase of its emphasis on the egocentric individual. It's already forecast here. And that the emphasis on dogma, I suppose he means the councils of the various Christian councils of Nicaea and Chalcedon and Ephesus and so forth, that dogmatic thinking is itself a manifestation of the either-or dualistic type thinking of the mental consciousness structure in which you're either with us or you're against us. And so dogma begins to replace mythological narratives in that sense. And the mythological narratives are polaristic and ambivalent in the mythical consciousness structure, in which we have gods, whereas in the magic he doesn't say that we have gods, we have instead graven images, presumably images of animals, but also ancestor figures. He does say here on the next page that in terms of the social structures, that the social structure of the magical consciousness is the tribal world of clan and kith and kin, whereas the social structure of the mythic world is parental and concerned with ancestor worship because it is parental and it's backward oriented back toward the past, not the future. It's predominantly matriarchal in its emphasis, whereas the mental is predominantly patriarchal, is forward-looking, and tends to put the emphasis on the son, the father's son, and is therefore has a child adulation and is future directed for that reason, that the mythical, in a way that the mythical and the magical are not. So what I have characterized elsewhere in my writings is the difference between the wonder child versus the elders, and I characterize the wonder child as the great mythical image of Western civilization, beginning from Minoan Crete on through the Greeks, on down to the West's transformation of the world in terms of these constant production of gadgets and miracles, whether the latest wonder child is a Steve Jobs or whoever it is who's in charge of bringing out the latest novelties and gadgets that are constantly forcing us to change and readapt, so that we're living in a society that's basically built on social quicksand. None of us can get any footing on it. And the wonderful writings of Zygmunt Bauman talk about this liquid modernity, he calls it, which is a perfect name for it. Basically, it's the same thing that Gebser's talking about here, about the child adulation, the forward-thinking child adulation of the mental consciousness structure, in opposition to the parental imagos that are emphasized in the mythical consciousness structure. Although I do think that he makes a mistake in situating ancestor worship per se in the epoch of the mythical consciousness structure, since I think it belongs and originates in the magical consciousness structure, that is to say in the realm of tribal man, which indeed is primarily concerned with totems and dead ancestors in a way that the mythical world of high civilization beginning with the Bronze Age is not. I've studied the evolution of the Neolithic in quite a bit of detail and came to the conclusion that the primary religious modality of the Neolithic is ancestor worship. You find revered human skulls placed everywhere. You find them in niches in the walls. You find at Jericho the skulls of the revered dead are removed, and the facial features are actually reconstructed in clay and adulated. The head is always separated from the body in these ancestor cults. At Ain Ghazal we have these creepy visages that are clearly the ancestral dead. And so all through the Neolithic, and the Neolithic is the sort of transitional period of the deficient magical phase and the beginnings of the earliest efficient mythical phase. So there's an overlap between them. What Gebser says is the mythicals concerned with seasonal festivals must obviously begin deep back in the pre-pottery Neolithic, which extends from roughly 10,000 to 6,000 BC, and in which ancestor worship attains its apogee at sites like Chayonu, dating 8,000 BC in Syria. We find caches of skulls, piles of human skulls in a temple underneath the ground in the basement. And it's at this site also at Chayonu that human sacrifice seems to have come into being. And human sacrifice is, rightly, as Gebser says in this chapter, connected with the matriarchy, the goddesses, the predominant mythological images in this epoch. But so are the ancestral dead. And these ancestral dead begin to disappear. You can already see them fading out in the later Neolithic, the so-called pottery Neolithic, that begins to come in around 7,000 to 6,000 BC, and in which we get the rise of pyrotechnologies that create the first pottery, which, by the way, on the first pottery vessels that come into being, the elaborate ones that are associated with the Halafians and the Samarans, we see the first mandalas coming into being. So you can already see on the bottoms of these pottery vessels the first mandalic organizations. Joseph Campbell talks about this in one of his essays, The Symbol Without Meaning, that the mandala is a historically conditioned form, not, as Jung said, something innate to the psyche. It isn't innate at all. It's a historically conditioned form that comes into being here about 6,000 BC to organize civilization, and we begin to get the earliest origins then of Gebser's mythical consciousness structure with its circular mandalic orientation right about the pottery Neolithic, which is a kind of threshold. All these other phenomena disappear. The skull cult, for the most part, fades out at that point, except at certain sites amongst the Halafians who continue on with it. It fades out, and we get an emphasis on more farming implements come into being. There are fewer weapons, and more temples are being built. And then by the time we get to the Bronze Age with the Sumerians, we have, with the Sumerian deities now, we have an emphasis and a shift into a purely mythical world, no longer magical, purely, almost purely anyway, mythical world. The magical always survives, of course, in spell casting, and the Sumerian concern with haruspicy, which is the study of entrails and omens and astrology. That's all part of the magical. But with the rise of the Sumerians, we have, for the first time, the creation of these deities, each one of whom is the patron of a particular technology. Each god is associated with a different technology, whereas before the ancestor figures aren't linked with technology because they normally prohibit it. Their job, as in the Australian myth of the Wandjina, who, with their primary mouths in the dream time, pronounce the symbols that make all the magical artifacts appear, and then once their mouths are taken away, they can no longer create new things. That's the realm that's the opposite of the realm of the wonder child. That is the realm of the magical and mythical consciousness structures, but more so the magical, with its emphasis on the tribal cult of the ancestral dead and its backward past orientation, where the dead are not linked with technology because they always say no to new technologies. So with the rise of high civilization, I think we're moving out of the cult of the ancestor worship that Gebser says here should be linked with the mythical. It really belongs with the magical. We're moving out of that with these gods now, each one becoming the patron of the new technology. Enki is associated with irrigation. Ninurta is also the god who invented irrigation. Inanna is the patron goddess of astronomy. The moon god Nanasene is the builder of boats, which are shaped like crescent moons. There's even a brick god. Every technology has its own god, and so we've begun to shift away from the ancestor cults to the cults of the gods, each of whom descends down from the heavens to the earth and creates a new technology to enable man to construct a mirror image on the earth of the great macrocosm that the gods live in up above. So I would amend Gebser's discussion there in that sense, although I think he's got just about everything else right. And I particularly like his discussion of matriarchy versus patriarchy, in which he says that the mythical consciousness structure is associated with the matriarchy, whereas the mental consciousness structure is associated with the patriarchy. And that you can see in dragon slayer myths, and especially in myths like, for instance, Aeschylus's telling of the story, his Oresteia, but the telling of the story in which Orestes has to slay his mother. He is required to avenge his father's death and slay his mother, and in doing so, this is the patriarchal overturning of the matristic, matriarchal mother goddess cults of the ancient Neolithic, in which human sacrifice flourished, and now turning away from both human sacrifice and from the dominance of the mother. And you can also see this in the mental world of the Hebrews with the myth of Abraham and its rejection there of the cult of human sacrifice. That too is part of the mental patriarchal orientation, in which the woman loses out and she becomes mere chattel, mere property of the man who keeps them and regards them the same way the Abrahamic patriarch regards his flock of women the same way that he regards his flock of sheep, basically just his property for sowing the fields to produce his future generations. And so Gebser is right here that I think that the shift from the matriarchal to the patriarchal is also the shift from the mythical consciousness to the mental consciousness. But he says that in the integral consciousness structure, the two should come more into balance with each other in the integral consciousness structure. And I think we have to watch, though, that in some of the manifestations of the New Age, in fact, in almost all of it, there is a regression to the matriarchy. I think the New Age is very obsessed with female-dominant cults and images, and especially at places like out at San Francisco at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where they're producing a whole generation of weak men who are subservient to women, as William Irwin Thompson points out in his book, whose title is escaping me, The American Replacement of Nature, in which he says that in places like San Francisco, where you get this emphasis on a retrieval of the matriarchy, and a diminishment of the male ego so that he becomes subservient to the woman. So you get these compliant men who are dominated over by these big New Age goddess women of the Clarissa Pinkola Estes type or the Jean Houston type, who do everything they can to diminish and castrate the male's ability. I think we can see all of that. If you read the last chapter in Richard Tarnas's book, The Passion of the Western Mind, you can see him celebrating this cult of the goddess. And there's a lot of celebration in that school of very poor, mediocre works done by women, such as, for example, the books of Joanna Macy, or the works of Charlene Spretnak, which are very inferior. They're just average, mediocre works, but they're elevated and treated in that school as though they belong on the same shelf beside works, Joseph Campbell and Lewis Mumford and William Irwin Thompson, which they absolutely do not. And it has nothing to do with the sex of the individual concerned. It's just that there's a PC emphasis on elevating inferior works in order to fit a decayed, warmed over 60s political agenda that's long since deficient and past its heyday. So you have to watch for that in the New Age, in which I'm all for the study of religious forms and the celebration of religious thinking and the limitations placed on the masculine, over-assertive rationalizations of our civilization, which has gotten us into the trouble that it has, but not at the expense of diminishing the achievements of the male and regarding him as some sort of paltry servant of the great rotund mother. So anyway, that brings us to where I wanted to take it for this discussion of Gebser.